So what I've done is I've also added the bean for RabbitMQ as well. I just didn't want you guys to keep looking at me typing. So I've already created the RabbitMQ bean, and we are invoking that bean from the application context over here. And in the config we have the RabbitMQ bean created. So now your boss comes and tells you, or whoever is reviewing your code comes and tells you that they don't want all the beans created in one config file. They want a separate config file for ActiveMQ beans, and they want a separate config file for RabbitMQ beans. So now let's create separate MQ files for each module, and then we'll see how to invoke the beans once we have the separate config files. Because in live coding or in day-to-day work, there might be a lot of beans, and you don't want to create a lot of beans in just one file. You want separate files depending on your context or your module. So let's see how to create that. So I'm going to create one config file for RabbitMQ and one config file for ActiveMQ. So as you know, you have to mark it as configuration or annotate it as configuration. And basically cut paste the code from the messaging config to our new config file. Let's do the same thing for RabbitMQ. So now we have separate configuration. So now the messaging.config will import those two configuration files. So let's see how to write that code. So here in messaging.config, we'll use the import annotation and include ActiveMQ config and RabbitMQ config. So now let's look at our application.java. And the application.java is still reading the messaging.config. So everything should run now as it was earlier. And as you can see, it's still running. Now instead of messaging.config over here, we could have written ActiveMQ config and just read the ActiveMQ bean from the application context. And we have to comment out the RabbitMQ portion, because if we are reading the ActiveMQ config into the application context, then there won't be any beans for RabbitMQ config, since we have only included ActiveMQ config. So once you run the application, it still runs. Now let me revert it back to messaging config. So this is how you can separate your configuration across multiple files, and then how to import multiple configuration files into a common configuration file.